Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined this afternoon by conscious CARACAL, as well as MARHOBANE, who will be going by his given name Rob this afternoon. You should all feel free to view him as a normal human being without a code name. And the subject of our discussion will be South Africa, the things that are going on there at present. We're going to be trying to address a few sort of basic questions that people outside the country will no doubt have, perhaps be brought up to date on, the sort of latest snapshot of the situation, and perhaps hear something about the kind of solutions or ways of addressing the issues that are currently in play. And I hope that in large part, we will have ourselves disabused of any number of misconceptions or assumptions about what's going on there. I know that for my part, I'm probably someone who needs an education in that respect. Before I allow these guys to briefly introduce themselves, let me just do the quick shilling. The first of the ones that I want to do, I'm going to skip things like my book and the rest so that we can have the maximum amount of time with these people who've been kind enough to make themselves available today. I do, however, want to show the people who are supporting the channel. I refer to them as the Praetorian Chads because that's precisely what they are. These Praetorian Chads are the ones who make all of this possible. I want to thank all of them very much for the support that they give the channel. Without it, I really wouldn't be able to do much at all. Please do follow this channel, Semiagog, as well as A Safer Space. You can do it on BitChute. You can do it on YouTube. I'm on Telegram. I'm on Odyssey. I very much recommend that everyone get over to Odyssey and subscribe. So yeah, Telegram, Odyssey, Gab, Twitter, and the rest. And I think that does it for that. So thanks again to the people who support the channel. So before we get started talking about South Africa in the 2-hour time frame that we have available, let's start with a conscious CARACAL. Perhaps you can just give everybody a quick introduction, and I'm going to ask this at the end, but do go ahead and shill or promote anything that you need to at the outset, because usually you have to tell people twice.
Well, thank you very much for having us on. I find it interesting that you referred to your Patreons. I don't know if I heard you correctly. It sounds like you were saying Praetorian Chads.
No, it means like in Rome, like
the Praetorian Guard.
Praetorian Guards.
No, of course. But in South Africa, I live in Pretoria. I'm currently streaming from the city of Pretoria, but that's named after Andries Pretorius, who was a Voortrekker leader in South Africa. So it has a bit of a different meaning if you were to use that term in South Africa. We definitely have a lot of Praetorian Chads here in the pubs in Pretoria as well. But
so you are quite possibly the most Praetorian Chad?
I sure hope so. So I'm Ernst van Sail, or Conscious CARACAL, South African YouTuber, do political analysis, some philosophy thrown in there. Also, I'm on Twitter as well, where I also put my thoughts out there. I also work for AfriForum, which is the largest civil rights organization in the Southern Hemisphere. It is specifically a civil rights organization that's orientated around protecting minority rights. Now, in America, minority might mean something different than it might mean in South Africa, or what immediately comes to mind. In South Africa, and I think we're going to get into that, there's quite a few different types of minorities that play a big role. I mean, here we definitely have the cultural minority aspect, racial minority, linguistic minorities. I mean, I'm a super minority in that regard, seeing as I'm a racial minority, cultural minority, and a linguistic minority in my country. I'm a 9th generation South African, or rather southern tip of African. Seeing as my family my first ancestor arrived here in 1688. So my family is literally, my genes have literally been longer at the southern tip of Africa than your country's been a country, just to put that into perspective. In short, there's the YouTube side, there's the Twitter side, and then there's also my work for AfriForum, which I would definitely recommend your viewers go check out AfriForum's website. I mean, if you just Google AfriForum, you'll definitely find it. It will be one of the first results. So that would be my main suggestion if you want to keep up to date with news happenings here in South Africa, and also specifically minority rights, as you will get into later in the discussion.
Very good. And Rob, How would you introduce yourself, and what would you like to shill and present, and the rest?
Well, I don't know. I recently graduated from a master's degree here in the Netherlands in basically global governance. Actually, it's so the most sort of globalist public admin course you can get. It's called Crisis and Security Management, which is awfully apropos, isn't it? I did my thesis on drug prohibition, demonstrating that it can be done, which which is a surprisingly controversial position in academia. And I like a whole bunch of videos on South African history, which visualize the political system in South Africa as being something that shifts between very radically different dispensations in very rapid in very sort of sharp succession. And I write a blog with lots of long essays on African topics, but occasionally on sort of, global level Western civilization kind of stuff. So I also do some work for AfriForum at the moment. Well, not for AfriForum, actually. I'm busy translating a book by Flip Buys, who's the leader of the Solidariteit movement, of which AfriForum is a part. And it's called the Pad na Selfbestuur, or the Road to Self-Governance, is how I'm rendering it into English. And then I'm talking to Ernst's boss, Ernst, about writing a piece of research on sort of resistance strategies and so on. So I'll get a chance to do some real research into that soon. But yeah, that's kind of where I am.
And just very, very quickly, since it was clear that Conscious CARACAL is not just in South Africa or at the southern tip of the great and dark African continent, but his genetics go back to the very end of the 17th century. Because people might not be aware.
Oh, you want to see my pedigree papers?
No, not at all. What I would like to just make sure is that, since I know that you come from South Africa originally, but since you said you were in the Netherlands, perhaps you could let everybody know you are in fact from South Africa, correct?
Yeah, I'm quite South African. My family's at least as established as Ernst. We go back quite far. I've been established in the Cape for hundreds of years. Various ancestors in government positions. Gijsbert Reitz-Hofmeyr, one of the first governors of Namibia, Jan Hendrik Hofmeyr, deputy prime minister, Jan descendant from the brother of Piet Retief that took over the farm when Piet Retief decided to bugger off into the interior.
You've got all your deep roots. You've got all your bona fides and your letters of recommendation and your established history. You are a South African as well, not Dutch.
Yes, but my ancestors were liberals, and so they decided they would teach their children English, and so I've, I didn't grow up Afrikaans, although I grew up in Afrikaans town. So I can speak the language, and
the difference isn't that you're not of Afrikaans descent. So, for example, I had imagined perhaps you have more of a British background, but that's not the case. It's simply that your parents.
Well, my mother's very English. Yeah, well, my mother's very English. Her father was American, and her mother was I think second or third generation immigrant. And her background is mostly Scottish, genetically, I would say. Although, I mean, being fashionable modern people, we've done the little analysis, and for some reason, there's Khoisan blood on both sides of the family. And regarding my mother, we have no idea how that got there, because they're not as well established in the Cape as my father's family is. Whereas on my father's family, we do know precisely who comes from where. So there's a small selection of native Cape people who sort of, with whom almost all white South Africans share ancestry. And we've got that because it's a fairly usual feature of ours.
All right, so we're dealing with two South Africans well versed in the history and the intricacies of this place that I'm only just beginning to grasp. I guess the first place to start, and of course I invite you before you do, if there's anything else you wanted to cover from this opening section that you missed, please insert it. But once you do so, if indeed you need to, let's jump over to this idea of what's happening there now. I've looked at the situation there myself a couple of times over the past 3 or 4 years. It certainly seems as though there is all sorts of excitement, all sorts of potential for trouble, all sorts of tension, and any number of sort of perforated lines along which the uneasy sort of truce, the half-truce maybe that exists, could be torn. But you guys are in a much better position. Obviously, that's why you're here, to sort of lay out what's going on there. Since Rob, you were just speaking, maybe we'll move back to Conscious CARACAL, and you can present your view of the situation at present. Do your best to provide a snapshot for people who are completely unfamiliar with it, as some people watching might be, and then we'll go from that over to Rob and see if he can further dimensionalize your description.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect approach. I'll give you the skeleton and then Rob can put some muscle on it. So just maybe for people that aren't boffins on what's happening in South Africa or what happened. So as everyone knows, the Rainbow Nation was birthed in 1994 when the first when the ANC government came to power. So then to line out that timeline very superficially, but I think that'll give you the right picture, is the first in the 90s, things were looking up. The whole world was pretty much, South Africa was their darling. We couldn't do any wrong. Every analyst from all over was pretty much selling South Africa as the place to be, the place to invest your money. This is the new up and coming African power. This is where you need to invest. This is where you really are going to see some massive profits. And specifically towards the end of the 90s and early 2000s, things were going well for South Africa. We were pretty much doing pretty well economically. There was still this Rainbow Nation dream everywhere. You could feel in terms of people committing to this pretty much post 1994 South Africa. There was a lot of really, you did pretty much fill a 20-minute segment to really go into this period, because it's very fascinating. I'm definitely want to hear what Rob has to add there as well. But this early 2000s, late 90s period was almost like this honeymoon phase for the new South Africa. And this is the phase where I grew up in as well, where you have this hopeful feeling, everything is working out, things are looking up, the economy's doing well, unemployment's going down, and all these fears that were surrounding the 1994 election seem to all be conspiracy theories, and nothing really seems to have been there seems to have been no danger at all. And then after Thabo Mbeki, who was the president that came after Nelson Mandela, was pretty much kicked out by his party and replaced by Jacob Zuma, then you get a new proto-dispensation, if you will, where the ANC starts massively expanding the state apparatus. They massively expand state spending, debt goes through the roof, and the whole narrative around what South Africa is starts to change. Then at the end of the Zuma era, you get pretty much all these revelations of what we call state capture, where the South African government, it is revealed that the whole South African government apparatus has been pretty much just rotten to the core with corruption, and the state is pretty much dysfunctional. Things aren't working as they should. Things are actually falling apart, and the cracks only really start to show after this is revealed. So then, in a desperate attempt to save not only the ANC, but also the Rainbow Nation dream, Jacob Zuma is replaced by the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, in what is called the New Dawn. where we are promised that things are going to get back on track. The Zuma years were just a blemish on the ANC's soul, not really a true reflection of it. And Cyril Ramaphosa is going to get to the root of corruption. He's going to fix Eskom, something that's also, I think, of major relevance to the South African picture, is our state power supplier. So pretty much power in South Africa, or electricity, is nationalized. So Eskom provides all the electricity, and we started experiencing rolling blackouts in 2007, what we call load shedding, not rolling blackouts. So, and that started in 2007, and now in 2021, we still have rolling blackouts. So that has not been fixed. But under this new dawn, under Cyril Ramaphosa, that was supposed to be fixed. Corruption was supposed to be on track in regards to rooting it out. And now in 2021, Cyril Ramaphosa came into power in 2018. In 2021, things are not looking up. Cyril Ramaphosa, there's been no consequences for all the state corruption that's been exposed. We still have load shedding. The radical rhetoric from the ANC has not died down. It's actually ramped up. I've actually seen a lot more disgusting rhetoric from the current administration than the previous one. I mean, it was this current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, this moderate, this leader that's going to save South Africa, that in 2018 in New York told the world that, and I quote, "There is no murdering of white farmers in South Africa." Now, I mean, I can still understand if you want to try and spin it in regards to it's not as bad, and you underplay the numbers and you say, no, it's actually just normal crime. But no, he had the balls to actually go full on double down and say, no, there's actually no murdering of white farmers in South Africa, and there's no land grabs either, is also what he said. Both lies, absolute lies. And of course, as you would expect, the media was very quick to fact check him and set things straight. Absolutely not. There was no fact checking going on. If I can actually paraphrase one of I can't exactly remember the headline, but it was something like, when Cyril Ramaphosa said there are no white farmers being murdered in South Africa, here is what he really meant. And there's like an entire op-ed in regards to deciphering what the president actually meant and why he's actually the good guy. So now you get to 2020 with the lockdowns and the ANC just centralizing its power even more. And you have pretty much what me and Rob have been saying for a while, what I call media capture, where you see that the South African media apparatus is completely behind Cyril Ramaphosa and his administration. You get headlines like Cyril Ramaphosa's speech was Churchillian, and you get people writing opinion pieces about how magnificent this leader is. Very much the same type of treatment that you get with Joe Biden in America, just with Cyril Ramaphosa. And I find it interesting that the Biden administration is also running on a narrative similar to the Ramaphosa one of a new dawn, of there was this dark period and now we're going back to normal. America is back, baby. And it's the same with South Africa, where our current president is also riding that wave of South Africa is back. Rainbow Nation is back on track. No need to worry, no need to fear. So that's all the way up to now. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of other stuff that happened in between. But I think I'm going to hand the mic over to Mr. Daigan so you can put some muscle on that skeleton.
The only thing I would ask if you can throw in there is, you have the picture of the ANC and Ramaphosa, but who's the fellow with who favors the little red berets and likes to say,
that's Julius Malema. He's the leader of the third largest political party in South Africa, the Economic Freedom Fighters. They came onto the scene in 2013. Julius Malema was first the head of the ANC's Youth League, and then he was expelled from the ANC. So they're the supposed opposition, but they are pretty much, as you can see from their rhetoric and what they're doing, the tail's pretty much wagging the dog. The ANC, from what I can see, uses the EFF to pretty much propose. They test the waters with radical rhetoric and radical policy suggestions, see how the public reacts. If there's a nice reaction, the ANC takes that narrative over. If there's not, they kind of step back. And you could see that with expropriation without compensation, something the EFF tabled first. And then when the ANC saw there was enough, there seemed to be enough backing behind it and not a lot of pushback from their electorate, and they still were winning elections, even though expropriation without compensation was being openly debated and they weren't opposing it. They fully adopted it as pretty much their new policy. So, or that's what they're going to try and adopt as their full policy very soon.
Right. Well, I just had wanted to bring that up just to underscore for people that, you know, whenever and this, again, I don't know much about this, and I'm very quickly going to turn it over to Rob. But, you know, when you hear terrible things about what, for example, the ANC is either doing or contemplating or trying to kick sand backwards in the cat box to cover, you know, you can always rest assured that there are any number of other groups that are far worse and probably directly involved in, you know, more corrupt things or more aggressive or violent programs than the rest. So I just wanted to underscore the fact that there are many players, and you know, the ANC is quite likely not even the worst of them. But sorry, Rob, sir.
Well, I think part of the problem here that we have in South Africa is that even for many people in South Africa, we tend to look at it as if it is just another Western liberal democracy. But even though those structures are inscribed in law, that really doesn't describe what's going on a day-to-day basis. So what you have to understand is that since the 1990s, the ANC, the ruling party, has had about a 2/3 majority of the electorate. They dominate the parliament, and it's a partyless democracy, which means that they have complete control over the delegates in the parliament. So you've got to understand that there's no political independence amongst the ANC members, and they dominate the parliament. They can get past whatever they want, right? But they're extremely cautious because they realize better than most people in the West that actually legislation is everything. And that if they press too hard, then you'll get reactions from civil society, you'll get reactions from, you know, the judiciary, you'll get reactions from various different departments, you might have a split in the civil service. It's all of these kind of things. So they're not negotiating with people in parliament. Parliament's a rubber stamp. Where the negotiation really takes place is behind the scenes with informal measurements. And there's a lot of things that happen within the ANC. Now, how the party works is, so they've got all of these like local branch structures and everything. But what is understood very well is that you never, ever criticize leadership in public. Now, this is what keeps the whole thing together. Anyone at a local level who complains about corruption usually gets killed, especially in KwaZulu-Natal. And so, and it gets really intense. It was at its most intense during the leadership battle between Jacob Zuma and Cyril Ramaphosa in the party leadership election in 2017. And in that province alone, about 300 people got assassinated. So it was fairly violent. This isn't talked about very much, but it's. I mean, like the journalists will know about it. The sort of old, you know, hardened hacks who are mostly left wing, but they're actually quite pragmatic. And I think, look, we're very hard on them because we're very frustrated with the fact that they go far too easy on the ANC, and they really do buy into the South Africanism, the idea that South Africa is actually a thing, a real country, which it's not. It's sort of a very cruel, chimeric colonial experiment. But the the problem with the ANC is that it makes it very, very difficult to know precisely what's going on the inside, and makes everything very sort of opaque. They have something called the Youth League, and they have something called the MK Veterans Association. Now, Mkhonto Sizwe was the armed wing of the party that did most of the struggle during the old days. And now they have the MK Veterans. But the MK Veterans seem to mostly be under 30, funnily enough. And so they get a bailout through the military pensions fund. So they draw salaries through a military pensions fund, and they train youth in military programs still. And there are also sort of like induction camps that they do, usually run by the ANC Youth League. And every now and again, one of the flyers will appear on some Facebook group or some newspaper article. It's not just them, it's also the PAC, who broke away from the ANC back in 1959, and the EFF, who broke away in 2013. They were registered as an informal party in 2014. Now, all of them do paramilitary training for young people, all of them.
And why? Just very quickly,
states-
what do you think the motivation is for that paramilitary training for young people? I'm certainly myself, any number of people in the chat can make guesses, but rather than guess, perhaps you could shed some light on why they're doing that.
I'll tell you exactly what I think in a very blunt sort of fashion. I think, look, the biggest role it plays is its initiation. That's the biggest role it plays. It plays initiation. It gets all the kids, young guys inducted. Everyone, when you're a young dude holding a gun, being powerful, knowing how to kill a guy, like, oh no, I'm a special agent now. So they do a lot of that. And then it also instills them a fantasy of taking their country back completely, because the revolution was incomplete.
And
the basis
define for me, I'm sorry, don't mean to cut you off, but just to clarify, what does taking it back, quote unquote, completely entail?
Well, you've got to understand that they have this document that actually is the founding document for the ANC as it is now. Now, the ANC, when it began, was actually a coalition of aristocrats and Western-educated elites, and they were arguing for rights for themselves. But there was a change in the 1950s because the ANC were completely shut out of the political system. So they started looking around for solutions, and the communists gained the upper hand in the party. And they reached out to the Soviet Union. When they in 1955, they formed this big coalition of, like, white feminists, and liberals, and the Indian Congress, and colored leaders, and if anyone, I'm sure everyone knows this, but just in case anyone doesn't know, colored people are a separate category from black people, and they're sort of like this catch-all term for people like the indigenous people of South Africa called the Khoisan, most of whom have lost their language. And speak Afrikaans, and people of Malaysian descent, and so on and so forth. So, and people of mixed race heritage. So, colors, another category. So you have all of these different, So all of these different left-wing coalitions sort of come together in a congress, and they hammer out this document called the Freedom Charter. And the Freedom Charter says, okay, a whole bunch of things, like, all of the industry should be nationalized, and everyone should get free shit. And then most importantly and most interestingly, one of the rights they wanted to give people is people should have the right to settle anywhere they want. So, like, property rights go bye-bye.
Open borders, yes. And I can see all the...
No, not open borders. Think about it in terms of, like, okay, there's an empty field over there. I can go and put my house down if I want to.
Sorry, I should say perfect isomorphism for the concept of open borders, in the sense that the nation's borders, as well as the borders of your home or your personal property, are all gone. And you can see the touches of the sort of...
So that's been achieved now. Legally, that's actually been achieved now under the coronavirus rules, because in the 25th of August, there was a court ruling that abolished the common law right to counter spoliation. And so what happened is that you are no longer allowed to, under any circumstances, to remove a squatter from your house. And now I say under any circumstances because even if you go to the courts, they can't remove the person until the government decides to remove the state of emergency. But why would they remove the state of emergency when it actually allows them to circumvent procurement laws in the civil service, and so basically funnel out at a rate hitherto unseen in the history of the land public laws? And so Cyril Ramaphosa has ushered in the largest wave of corruption and theft that has ever occurred to us. He is the most corrupt president, and he's also one of the richest people in the country, just coincidentally. And the situation we're dealing with now is, how I mentioned, the Freedom Charter, walk everywhere you want, put your house down. For years now, in order to undermine minority areas, they've actually paid people to move, especially young men who are trying to
find minority areas.
So minority areas are areas that are inhabited predominantly by ethnic minorities, white, colored, or Indian. Now, white and Indian people tend to vote more for the DA, which is the largest opposition party, than black people do. And the DA is dominant. Beg your pardon?
Sorry, we have a little bit of a lag. I apologize. Don't mean to so rudely cut you off. I did want to ask, as something to contrast, just for people who are getting their bearings about this, myself among them, against this idea of the different minority groups, some of which that you just mentioned, what group or groups form the overwhelming majority?
Well, that would be black people. So black people consist of, depending on how you draw them, about roughly 10 different nations. So you have Xhosa, Zulu, Xhosa, Zulu, Swazi, Sotho, Tswana, Ndebele, Shona. Well, no, Shona is actually from Zimbabwe. They're immigrants from Zimbabwe in a large crowd. And then there's the Tsonga, who are often derogatorily called Shangaan, which is actually the name of a different tribe that's over the border in Mozambique. And they're extremely abused. And then there is the Venda. Now, the Venda are very interesting because they are generally seen.
Not in there.
Did I not mention the Zulu? The Zulu are easily the most important.
And are they the largest?
Yeah, the Zulu are the largest cultural group in South Africa.
And do they tend to dominate?
It depends.
No.
Seeing as, look, for example, the ANC demonstrated very well. Nelson Mandela was a Xhosa, and Thabo Mbeki was a Xhosa, and Jacob Zuma was a Zulu. So what's the first thing that Jacob Zuma does when he gets into power? He fills the ANC with Zulus. So Ramaphosa comes in, who's a Venda, which is very strange. I think Rob was getting to that. Not really. The Venda are a very small cultural group in South Africa. But now...
but they are the president's ethnicity. That is the important bit.
Yeah. Before you get to that, just to finish that point. So there's a lot of cultural factions in South Africa, specifically within the ANC as well. And they're not... And I think and we will get to that after this segment or in a little bit. You can't really understand South Africa through just a racial lens of there's a black group and a white group and a colored group. The cultural factors are very important to understand the power dynamics, how the different groups interact with each other, how they view each other in the bigger picture. But we'll get into all of that, and I'll allow Rob to continue his point there.
Well, the thing is that, so the ANC's ethnic base is actually with the Xhosa. And for decades, ever since Oliver Tambo came to power, and actually well before then, the Xhosa have dominated the ANC. So if you know South Africa and you're down in the Cape, the province that's to the east of the Cape is that's where the Xhosa live for the most part. So yeah, they absolutely dominate. But briefly, and even when you have other people in charge like Jacob Zuma, who is Zulu, and actually ran on an electoral campaign of 100% Zulu, which, I mean, this distilled all of the liberal sort of all of the liberal people in the white press, which I find, in retrospect I find quite funny. I mean, like, I was at the time I was a sort of liberal fella myself, so I had a so I was like, no, you can't do that. You know, you can't appeal to your ethnicity. Which, the one thing about Jacob Zuma you have to know, and the reason that he's so despised, is not because he stole, because his predecessor was guilty of some extraordinarily extravagant corruption and abuse of power. So what they really hate Jacob Zuma for, the very interesting thing, he basically showed the middle finger to every international organization. He actually sheltered Omar Bashir, not Omar Bashir, it is Omar Bashir. What's wrong with my brain this evening? From Sudan, when he was escaping the ICC for war crimes charges. He sheltered him in South Africa and refused to hand him over to the International Criminal Court. And he actually threatened to withdraw South Africa from the criminal ICC. And he basically, he's very interesting because he's completely in on this whole game. And one of my favorite ones is, everyone goes on him about him for Nkandla. Now, Nkandla is this big palace complex that he basically built in rural KwaZulu-Natal. And the interesting thing is that year, the 2017 was the last year that the UK gave us foreign aid. And interestingly enough, the foreign aid budget for that year is the same size as the price on Kandla's development. And so I suspect that out of a sort of sense, he nicked the UK foreign aid budget to say, you don't have any control over us. What's happened with Ramaphosa is courting every single globalist organization. And he's courting every single globalist policy. He's going to introduce a continental all-Africa passport next year. This year, end of this year. And he pushes, he justifies all of the domestic policies in terms of the sustainable development goals. And if you look at the policies that he writes, like half the policies, like the lockdown policies, all of the white papers that they write and the public press releases, they're dog's breakfast. You go through them and they like repeat things and they forget details, they get figures wrong. But the reports they release to the UN are always crisp, always on point, highly detailed, on spec, completely professional.
And it sounds like they're very much using the necessary, favored terms and terminology that everyone wants to hear about, sustainability and responsibility and, these kinds of things.
Access to land. So Sustainable Development Goal 10 is the mechanism by which they justify the expropriation of land.
Right. So it sounds like it's just the same old bullshit dressed up in slightly different ways relative to, the requirements of the people he has to keep happy and the goals he wishes to achieve. Now, we do have... Go on, sorry.
I was going to say that the thing about Cyril Ramaphosa is because he's a vendor, and a vendor is an extremely tiny portion of the population. They're one of the smallest ethnic groups in the country. And they have a reputation which is very similar to that which Jews have in the West, which is the, mercantile, untrustworthy, etc. That kind of stereotype. And Cyril Ramaphosa doesn't do anything to go against that stereotype. And what he does in the party is he's a coalition builder. And because he has no natural ethnic base to appeal to, like Jacob Zuma did, or all the Xhosaleses before him, he has to appeal to coalitions of ideological groups, unions, because he came from the union organizing background. He appeals to big financial groups. He appeals to all of these different coalitions. And his big one is he appeals to the communists and he appeals to the civil servants.
And
because South
presumably
Africa has a very large, highly well-paid civil service that do nothing.
And presumably he appeals as well to Chinese interests.
Yes, but it's funny. He reaches out to everybody and promises them everything that they want. So he's writing all of this legislation that promises to rid, and it really does threaten to completely take away anybody's right to property in South Africa. But he's done the same. He does the same with like media rights and everything. These unenforceable rules that give the power of complete arbitrary and total control.
Yeah, I think what we're dealing with in the United States is something similar, as I've just recently tweeted about. It's like the entire Potemkin village of rules and constitutional frameworks and respect for the voice of the electorate and the rest. The entire Potemkin village is in flames. And amidst the heaps of smoldering rubbish and awful, you've got howling imbeciles running around waving flexible dildos and rainbow flags as they search in the heaps of rubbish for 40 acres and a mule. It seems everywhere that the entire the farce of it all has been exposed. And it sounds as though that's very much happening where in the case of y'all's country as well. Because we have a certain limited amount of time, I would love to go down many of these rabbit holes. Many of them are very, very interesting. I want to move on to the question of why people who are dealing with the problems that they face there don't just emigrate. But before we get to that, I want to ask both of you, and let's start with you, Rob. Let's try to make it quick, but if you could, and then move over to Conscious CARACAL before we end this section. I think what I'm hungering for, and perhaps our audience as well, is some sort of really quick snapshot of the situation. Like, for example, you talked about parties and power groups and corruption and the rest. Is it possible to paint a picture from the perspective, it's hard to generalize, obviously, but is it possible to paint a picture, for example, of the prospects of white people, what they currently fear, what is perhaps coming over the horizon for them, just very quickly to properly paint the picture of the situation now? Because I feel that, and I don't wish to suggest that other minority groups might not also be threatened by these circumstances. You know, if you've got droughts, if you've got brownouts, I mean, everybody gets affected. But I think our audience is going to be particularly concerned about what the very small, relatively speaking, white minority there is looking at. What is coming over the horizon for them? If we can wrap that aspect of this section of sort of what the situation is now, then I think that will provide the necessary context for, on the one hand, the idea of why don't you leave, given that it quite possibly is that bad. Also for how you confront it if you're going to stay. But I do feel like we need to have a quick snapshot of what the situation is for whites in South Africa at present and what seems to be coming up over the horizon with some immediacy. And let's start with you, Rob. Try to, do your best to summarize it, and then we'll jump over to Conscious CARACAL.
So split, I guess, would be the point. The big division is the ethnic one. I mean, most Anglos are liberal. Most Afrikaners are, well, they're nationalists. And so there's a big problem with the split. And while there are many more pragmatic liberal Anglos, they still generally sort of believe in South Africa. Instead of seeing it as the sort of nasty little experiment it is. But we have the liberal representatives against the sort of progressive communist black nationalist coalition under the ANC. The Liberal Party, that's the Democratic Alliance, have only recently come out in principle against racial discrimination. Like, they're dominated by white Anglos, and only in the last year have they said, actually, discrimination against us is morally wrong.
But now, wait,
only in the last year.
If I may, Rob, just to focus this in tightly, or as tightly as I can, what you're talking about now is how white people in your country are reacting to the circumstances of white people, and how they construe them, how they frame them. What I'm interested in is what's actually happening to white people, not how they feel about it, not yet how they're responding to it. What can objectively be said about their current circumstances?
Okay. Because they still have a lot of wealth left over from the old days, relatively speaking. I don't say, I mean, by Western standards, it's like nothing. They're, living very, very low standards by American standards, for example. But by African standards, doing fairly well. Because of that, they can generally pay for private security, protect their houses, and things like that.
Protected from what?
From the absolutely extraordinary wave of violent crime in South Africa, which there's about 60 homicides a day in South Africa on average. Since the end of apartheid, we've lost more people to homicide than have died in the Afghan war, by a fair stretch, actually. More than 500,000 people, easily. So the thing is that there are different challenges for urban people and rural people. If you live in a rural area and you're a white farmer, you are extraordinarily likely to be attacked. I mean, look, Van Sale will know the statistics inside and out. His organization are the people who do the stats on that. So, but suffice it to say, it's extremely egregious.
Would it be fair to say that in rural areas it seems more like the whites are targeted, but in urban areas everyone suffers equally or somewhat equally from the same scourge?
I would say more or less that's the case. What's more evident is that if your business is over a certain size, you're not allowed to own it by yourself as a white person. You have to hand over a third of it to some black person, and they're very, very harsh quota systems in place everywhere. in schools, in universities, in the civil service, in pretty much everywhere. And so even Afrikaans language, like stuff like KykNet, right? KykNet is like a TV channel for Afrikaans content. Even there, because of the Black economic empowerment rules, which are the ones that say that you're supposed to be owned in part by Black people, it means that they're constantly being observed by ANC cronies who can cancel anything that they don't like editorially.
So we can see
you've got to understand that basically
Go ahead, basically.
Yeah, and so aside from just the ANC and Black economic empowerment, there's also the fact that they actually poured money into getting proxies to buy out the newspapers. And so between them and the Chinese Communist Party, almost everything in South Africa is owned. And so there is no news left that is not controlled in part by the ANC or the Chinese Communist Party. There's nothing left.
Okay. Well, let me try to summarize this quick, because I'd like to jump over to Conscious CARACAL, and I definitely want to hear more of your thoughts and his. But we've got a couple more subjects to get to, and I just wanted to summarize here. So before we jump to him, you already mentioned the fact that anybody can come in and basically be basically come in and squat your home, and they can't be kicked out. You have to have, for example, a certain representation in ownership that includes Black people for your property. You've got people basically observing everything that's going on through your media channels to, like block wardens or commissars, in order to ascertain whether or not you've, stepped outside the carefully drawn lines. The carefully drawn lines that no doubt are constantly changing to suit whatever, program they come up with that week. And generally, you've got a miserable situation with crime in the cities, where I would imagine whites with some proportion more property are more likely to be hit in terms of property crimes, just because they're a target being in a certain neighborhood, probably offset in large part by the fact that they can afford security that perhaps other groups can't. But in general, across the urban areas, the crime is just awful for everyone, probably with some aspects focused on whites. And then in rural areas, they're very much targeted, as I understand it, to be driven off of their property and to create generally just sort of a terroristic atmosphere, to let them know what's coming, so to speak. If that's a fair summary, then
worse. It gets much worse. So
tell us how it's worse.
Party actually in 2011. Okay. In 2011, the ruling party formed a pact with the gangs of the Western Cape. Now, these gangs are old; they've been around for 100 years. They have very, very deep roots. But what the ANC did is they provided them protection through the police, which are centrally run, and through the courts. They are responsible for over 50% of the homicides in the Western Cape. The Western Cape is where most is the largest concentration of ethnic minorities or racial minorities in South Africa. And so in order to undermine this province, which is run by the Liberal opposition, the Democratic Alliance, who are accused of being white supremacists, in order to undermine their credibility of governing, because they govern better than the ANC, very clearly, they have been sponsoring mass murder and drug dealing in that province to an enormous degree. And when the local metro police, which are controlled by the city of Cape Town, which is run by the Liberal opposition, are attacked by criminals, the South African National Police will actually undermine any attempt for them to get hold of these criminals quite often. They also extract taxes from all of the and control all of the squatter camps that have been set up, so that those people in the squatter camps are actually subject to a secondary tax system, which is run through extortion rackets, through an informal network, largely coordinated by the ruling party. And so you actually have a parallel state that is run through criminal networks and through violence that feeds directly into the ruling party, while they try and infiltrate the formal state, which is still in part controlled by people who believe in the rule of law.
It certainly
so
sounds worse.
there's a massive war going on here. Yeah, that is way worse. Yeah.
Well, then, Conscious Caracol, sir, what would you add to that in summary before we jump over to the question of why the hell everyone's not just leaving?
Well, seeing as Rob has given you a very grounded in a material sense summary of the situation, I'll give you a bit of a more of a cultural aspect. And I think Rob quickly touched on it, but I'm going to expand on it, and that's the mini culture war that's going on in South Africa. You were asking about what's the current situation here, well, specifically for the white minority, and that's why it's so important to view South Africa, to understand the cultural aspects of South Africa, and not just view it through a racial lens. Otherwise, you're going to see two white groups that don't really play well with each other, and you're not going to understand why. So the first thing that I think is very clear, especially is becoming more clear, is this mini culture war between, and Rob touched on it, the culture war between the leftists, the liberals, and not the nationalists, but rather the conservatives. So on the one side, you have the leftists who pretty much say the ANC has not gone far enough. They need to pretty much nationalize everything, national democratic revolution now. And then you have the liberals who pretty much say, no, the Rainbow Nation is not dead. We can still resurrect it. Here is how we do it. We need to go, you know what we need to do? Real liberalism has not been tried yet. That's what's going to save South Africa. So maybe just to elaborate a bit on that, real liberalism has been tried to a very large extent. If you go back, if you could get into a time machine and go back in time to the early 90s, the South African Constitution was being lauded by liberals, classical liberals across the world, as the second best document after the Bible. This was being put on a pedestal as the best constitution, only bested by the American Constitution. Property rights were in there, free speech was in there, everything, all the classical liberal things were in there for the mix. And this was pretty much a recipe for success. And then as this holy liberal document was increasingly read in a socialist manner, then the narrative changed a bit. Then the Constitution wasn't infallible anymore. Then the narrative became it's not perfect. It's a bit flawed. It needs a little bit of polishing, that's all. But as Ernst Roots, who also works for AfriForum, says, the power with a constitution, the power is not held by the document. The power is held by the interpreter. And I think that's maybe a lesson that you Americans are going to learn the hard way in the next few years if things go as they are going. So when it comes to South Africa, there's that mini culture war going on between the liberals, the leftists, and the conservatives. But it's not reflected in our political arena. If you are voting in a South African election, you have a choice between far left, or liberal, or left-leaning liberal. Pretty much are your three choices of realistic parties that can really make a difference. A real diversity of options. So this culture war, maybe to just summarize that as an important point, really came to a head in the last few years, where we saw debates within South Africa between individualists and communitarians, where you pretty much hear again from the liberals hearing this narrative: all South Africa needs is more liberalism. The real thing is that real liberalism hasn't been tried. That's what's going to happen. And a lot of conservatives are listening to them, thinking back to the 90s and thinking, but this is exactly what you told us back then. You said liberalism is going to save South Africa. Don't worry, the Constitution will protect you. I mean, that was the narrative that was being told specifically to Afrikaners, and that's one of the big threats that Afrikaners as a minority are facing in South Africa, is pretty much just the constant onslaught on our culture in regards to our language being forced out of education, our monuments being destroyed or removed, street names, town names, city names being changed. Everything is just a cultural onslaught, and this was exactly what was promised to us in the 90s, that this would not happen. Don't worry, the liberals said. The Constitution will protect you. You will still be able to have your own schools. Your children will still be able to study in their home language. Your culture will be preserved. Don't worry. And that's exactly what didn't happen. So now you're getting this, like I said, what I call a mini culture war, pretty much between the conservatives and the liberals, in terms of, so what solutions should we be proposing in South Africa. The liberals say, well, we just need more liberalism. And the conservatives say, well, maybe we should try something different. And that something different is community-based solutions or state-proof solutions, something that AfriForum and the Solidarity movements are having immense successes with. I mean, just this year, we built our own technical college, Soltech, which is a 300 million rand technical college building, not just an online college, that was built to give artisan training to young Afrikaans students. And it was pretty much crowdfunded. So it was not built with some billionaire's donation. It wasn't built with state funds. It was through donations through the community of 10 Rand, 50 Rand, 100 Rand. And that came together to build this immense monument to the community. And that's where the solutions lie. And I fall into that camp that say, no, actually, no, real liberalism has been tried. And it really pretty much gave us the South Africa that we have today to a large extent. It allowed the wiggle room for the leftists and the Marxists to pretty much run roughshod. So we need a new alternative. And that alternative is community-based solutions. And that's where the real on-the-ground results are coming through. And we're seeing it not just in education through the building of universities and colleges, but also through building safety infrastructure like neighborhood watches, farm patrols, also through cleaning up streets, rebuilding communities, rebuilding infrastructure, really coming together as communities and organizing as communities and making that those solutions state-proof, where you're not dependent on any type of state to really make your plan successful. The only thing that will determine whether you succeed or fail will be the energy of your community.
Well, then let's move on to the thank you for that. Let's move on to the next one. I'm going to try to stay more out of this. There were some people in the comments saying just let them speak, and I certainly would like to. I apologize for the delay, which just makes it even more barbaric when I jump in when Rob's speaking. So let me try this. Maybe I'll turn it over to you guys to sort between yourselves where you cut in. That way, y'all can sort that amongst yourselves. But I would ask this. It sounds as though you were saying at the beginning, or Conscious CARACAL had pointed out at the outset, when we've been talking about doing this, that there's the question of why people don't emigrate, and then there is the question of what you just termed state-proof solutions and the idea of parallelism. I know some of the people in the chat want to hear a bit about Orania, so perhaps you can. One or the other of you sort it out as you see fit to approach the topics. But certainly before we get into the business of parallelism and the rest and some of these state-proof solutions that I know a lot of people in the US are very interested in too, maybe you could just quickly touch on if people are leaving, and if so, which ones are leaving and which ones are staying. That whole thing that you glossed very nicely with why don't you just emigrate, bro? Maybe you could both address that a little bit and hopefully give us some sense of what proportion of people do you think are realistic there? Like you just talked about the communitarian aspect and the idea of cooperation and setting up parallel communities. If you had to frame in your mind some guess, it's, it can be a back of the cocktail napkin anecdotal assumption. I don't care, but can we get some kind of idea of, out of the whites that are there, how many of them are still saying that we just need to go and still try liberalism, and how many are actually getting more serious about it? So that I open it up to the two of you, and you can sort out which ones go where based on your expertise.
I think I'll start off, and then Rob can also add to that. So firstly, I think something that's very important that needs to be noted in regards to the question of why don't you just immigrate, bro? I think I just go back to my introduction, where I said I'm the ninth generation of my family here at the southern tip of Africa. It's something that's not very easy to explain to people when you just think in materialist terms. I mean, of course, I can make a lot more money in other countries. Of course, I can. I'm not going to be discriminated against by hundreds of race-based laws. But there's something bigger than myself here in South Africa. There's what we call in Afrikaans a roeping, or a calling. You were put here for a reason. I mean, that's one of the answers that I was given as a child when I asked, why are we in South Africa? Why was I born here and not in the Netherlands or Germany or France, where my ancestors are from? And the answer has always been, well, you're here for a reason. Otherwise, you would have been born in as a duchy. So it's something large. It's something that transcends materialism. It's something that's spiritual. It's something that's bigger than yourself. And I wrote an entire opinion piece on this. Unfortunately, it's in Afrikaans, so I'm not going to be able to link you to it. But there's an excitement in, for example, working for an organization like AfriForum and the Solidarity Movement, pioneering solutions that the whole world are going to have to start making notes about, and solutions that you in the future are going to have to figure out when we've long already figured it out. And I'm not willing to, the problems that we are experiencing in South Africa, I unfortunately foresee for a lot of Western countries if they are to go down the path that they are currently going down. You are currently dead set on pretty much a future of socialist kleptocrats and technocracy with a very strong racial flavor. But here in South Africa, we're already working on the solutions for it. So for me, there's a calling in being one of the pioneers for one of those solutions. And my ancestors went through a lot harder stuff than I'm going through now. My ancestors went on the Great Trek. My ancestors fought against the greatest empire in the world with outdated weapons and pretty much just a bunch of farmers. And what I'm going through now, just because I don't have electricity for 2 hours every week, some weeknights, that's not going to be enough for me to just immigrate. Because if I look at the story or the ancestors behind me, for me to just immigrate now would be the biggest anticlimax in a long while. So there is something bigger to it. So I think, and a lot of people on the right specifically seem to struggle with this concept, this non-materialist view of it, even though there seems to be this strong rebellion against, we can't just be materialist, we can't just view the world in materialist terms. Those same people tend to make the argument as well, but you'd be much more happy and wealthy and well off coming to our Western countries, these pinnacles of woke capitalism. Come to the countries where the problems that you are currently facing came from. Come to our countries where those problems were imported from. Everything will be fine. Come join the empire. Don't just live there in the little satellite. For me, that's not an option. For me, there's something bigger here. There's something that is worth fighting for. And I think you only understand that if you really grew up here and not really shitting on immigrants, or people that immigrate. It's a very personal decision. It's something that every person individually, it's a very hard decision. I don't think there is an easy decision when it comes to staying or leaving. That's something you decide for yourself. So if you decided to immigrate, that's your choice. I'm not gonna shame you or guilt you. But the only thing I ask of South African immigrants that look back on those that stayed is that they grant us that choose to stay the same type of understanding. Because the majority of my people and my culture can't immigrate. They don't have the monetary means. They don't have the ability. So many of them are old, and many of them, like I said, don't have the ability to immigrate. So I feel like I have a responsibility to work on the solutions to make sure that my culture has a future in South Africa, and that Afrikaners will still be here 100 years from now. Because at the same time, and this will be my last point on this question, there is a hard reality, a very hard cultural reality associated with immigrating. If Afrikaners immigrate to a country like Canada, England, or America, within 2 or 3 generations, their children will be Americans and Canadians and Australians, and probably won't even know where they came from. They won't even know about the Boer War or the Great Trek or Afrikaans as a language or the Afrikaner culture. So it is pretty much a cultural trade-off where, yes, you are moving towards prosperity, but the unfortunate reality is that 2 or 3 generations from now, you need to make peace with the fact that your grandchildren will not speak Afrikaans. Your grandchildren will probably be, or your children will probably be marrying people in that country where you moved to or immigrated to, which means that they will be raising their children as Americans, Canadians, speaking English, adopting the culture of the country that they immigrated to. So that is the cultural reality that people struggle with, the cultural reality that people need to make peace with. And if all the Afrikaners were to immigrate, it's going to be a near impossible battle to preserve our culture. So to a large extent, very much appreciate all the support from all the Afrikaners that have immigrated that still very much support the causes of AfriForum and what's going on in South Africa, and supporting everyone that stayed. But at the same time, I think there is a very strong and sad cultural reality to immigration that needs to be confronted, where it does, in the end, not really ensure that it gives your culture much less of a chance of surviving the long term. So it is a cultural question, and it's a question that's bigger than myself. It's something that every Afrikaner, being a cultural minority in your own country, is faced with. And that's why we fight so hard for our own universities, our own cultural institutions, preserving our history, preserving our monuments, because we know every day of our lives where our culture is being threatened. And I'll end my answer with there was this great quote from Milan Kundera about small nations, in pretty much regards to exactly what I was describing here. So I'm just going to pull it up here. So he said that small nations, the concept is not quantitative. It points to a condition, a fate. Small nations lack the fallacious sense of an eternal past and future. At any given moment in their history, they all pass through the antechambers of death, in constant confrontation with the arrogant ignorance of the mighty. They see their existence as perpetually threatened, or with a question mark hovering over it. For their very existence is the question. And I think that pretty much answers why you don't just immigrate, bro.
Yeah. No, for me, it's a much more simple thing. You know, the soil kind of gets in your blood a little bit, doesn't it? It's very hard to, it's you can't really let go spiritually. It's your place, and I think you can put reasons on it. So there are very reasonable ways that you can argue that people should look after their heritage, but at the end of the day, they have to want to, and they have to have a natural affection, a natural love for it. And I know that there's a tendency for people to want to make things extremely based and very very hardcore about these things. But the fact of the matter is that it's impossible not to feel affection for your neighbors in South Africa as well. I've my sort of disposition has spanned the entire political spectrum at this point, and one of the things that sort of kept me off the sort of I don't know, I struggle to commit to any sort of really hard sort of racial position for one very particular reason, which is that I've had very, very genuine affection for a great deal of people in South Africa of pretty much every persuasion. And while I'm not going to pretend that my loyalty is not first to my own kind, to say that runs to the exclusion of others would be ludicrous, and it would be a betrayal of people who've stood by me or even saved my life on many occasions. And I think it's a very complicated thing, and one of the things that has caused me an extraordinary amount of consternation from a lot of people sympathetic with our cause overseas is that I know very well that they would desperately wish to see us destroyed because it would be a propaganda victory, and because it would supply them with additional population who would come as refugees. And so I don't think that whatever our future happens to be, there's absolutely no future for white South Africans in being exclusive white nationalists, because we have to survive in a country that we love very dearly, with people who we share a long and difficult history with. And in many cases, we might even have to settle old scores, not entirely to our satisfaction or preference or desire. Because the game here is survival. The game here is preservation of what you can. And there are a lot of sort of very vain and romantic and arrogant positions that come from Europe, that come from America. People who imagine these sort of very grand and insane and bloody glories that decorate the pages of history books and fables, but the reality of political survival is actually a lot more dirty and disappointing, and the end goal is ultimately to survive and hope that you can create something out of it. But that's going to require doing things that pretty much everyone is going to dislike, left and right, within the South African community.
And indeed, you have
particularly now as we head towards collapse, which is
and indeed likely. You have a situation where many of you doubtless have situations where there are groups that are non-white that have historically been your allies, I would assume. And for that reason, it's not so simple as simply stepping in and saying it's X versus Y, because you've got groups of people who have a historical tradition of assisting you. So
I think that's why I said the cultural lens is so imperative for South Africa, because they are black and white groups that get along better because they share an allied history. They get along better than two other black groups. There are some black cultures that hate each other more than, for example, one white culture, the friction between one white culture and a black culture. And it's all that history that needs to be taken into account. And I think Rob said something there that I'd like to add to. And I saw something in the chat where someone said, I wouldn't live in Africa for $1 million. Well, I can tell you, I wouldn't leave Africa for $1 million. I'd rather live...
Yeah.
I'd rather live.
It's like betraying your fucking family. I mean, who the fuck does that?
Yeah,
I mean,
and maybe to address, to address something that Rob said. There's this, when you look at the online sphere, in the more right-leaning online sphere, there's this grasping for meaning and for tribe and for culture and for community. That's what we're not willing to give up by leaving South Africa. That's exactly what you're grasping and wanting. That's exactly what we don't want to leave. You're telling us, so I always use the metaphor of the leopards in the Western Cape Mountains. So even in the Western Cape, there are still leopards in the mountains. They're not the apex predators anymore. There's not a lot of them left, but at least they're free and in nature. And I'd rather be a leopard in the mountains than a leopard in a zoo. In the zoo, in the Western Zoo, you get all your food, you get protection, you don't have to hunt, everything is fine, but you live in a concrete.
But they cut your balls off.
Yeah, but they cut your balls off. I'd rather be living in the mountains. So to that question of I wouldn't live in Africa for $1 million, I wouldn't leave Africa for $1 million. I'd rather live in a small house here and be able to watch the African sunset and be drinking my dop than be living in some urban hellscape and pretty much being a number. I'd rather be a pioneer of future solutions in South Africa than be an office worker in the US but making a lot of money. So I think that's the difference. And I think that's what a lot of people need to, especially on the right, need to ponder. Those things that you grasp towards, that non-materialist view of the world, that return to tradition, that return to community, that return to having striving towards something bigger than yourself, being tied to the soil that you work and that you live on. That's what we're not willing to give up. Those that want to stay in South Africa for reasons that are bigger than themselves, for non-materialist reasons. And if you ponder that, if you take that idea and you chew a bit on it, you might understand why it's not as simple as just immigrate.
So, I mean, everyone knows, I presume everyone knows that British filmmaker Adam Curtis, sort of, kind of, old, sort of weird left, but not really sort of fella. But he said something very interesting in an interview where they were asking him, about how to solve all of these problems and everything, and he says, well, in order for anything to really change, people really have to give themselves up to something. And he said, the point at which this whole system will change is when you see people from the middle class, people who could have otherwise picked, a reasonably comfortable career option, choosing to leave their home and make themselves part of a movement for something, that won't benefit them materially, and may not even benefit. They may not even survive. And of course, the example he's bringing up is like the civil rights movement, where you had a lot of northern Yankees traveling south, to join the picket line and leaving their careers behind. Of course, some of them have done very well now, being picked by the WEF to be leaders of this, that, and the other. But they couldn't have seen that coming. They were up against something that they didn't know would win. They didn't know, and they really did sort of give themselves up for what they believed they ought to do, and they really did change something. Not that they weren't sort of bigger elites that wanted the same thing, but that's the nature of politics. You do need actual sort of serious, impassioned people in order to get anything done, and change will only come when the educated people that make up that sort of leadership middle, that managerial middle, decide to sort of up and quit and say, no, we want something else, and are really willing to sacrifice for it.
Well, apparently there are a number of people. There is a number, not quite sure about that, but in any case, some number of people have come forth out of the woodwork in South Africa in order to tackle this problem, as you have both laid out quite eloquently from parallel or from two directions, and they are creating solutions. One of the things that I saw has come up in the chat, and I was quite sure it was going to come up this evening, is this idea of Orania. I saw on a friend's channel, Don the Plebe, he was speaking to a gentleman from there who impressed me as competent and serious, as indeed you two gentlemen both strike me. And it seems that people are coming out of the woodwork to solve these problems, and they are competent and serious people. Now they've got a serious task. You could say that something like, you could call it Sisyphean. You could say it's rather like trying to clean out the Augean stables, given, aspects of the scale of it, the problems that you're facing. But people are coming out now, and they are trying to tackle this problem because they don't wish to leave, because they have this connection with place that you both referred to. And so in order that we don't sort of close this just on the dark notes of, staying in the midst of this problem and facing this struggle and the rest, I think there's been real progress made, like the technical university or training center that Conscious CARACAL was just talking about. There is the idea of Orania, which is maybe not as far along as a lot of people might imagine, but certainly given how they, carved their existence out of this sort of wasteland position, it's highly impressive. So there are a number of things that are happening. There are these sorts of things that got laid out at the beginning. This idea of parallelism or state-proof solutions. So I'd invite both of you at this point to maybe talk about what you're doing there and what kind of lessons we can learn. Because to tap what we looked at earlier, South Africa really is ahead of the curve in terms of what is coming for us in the West. And so your innovation, your experimentation, your pioneering spirit will quite likely become useful to us.
Rob, I did the introduction had the first speaking chance with the previous question, so the floor is all yours.
Well, what I'm doing is fairly modest, personally. So I'm trying to help out with. I'm trying to help out with the Solidariteit movement from my sort of squashed position up here in the Netherlands. So I graduated at the end of last year from my master's degree, and I'd been writing under a pseudonym. I'd been writing under a pseudonym for a while on this obscure little blog, and then I just started producing little videos, and mainly about South African history, trying to expose people to the fragility of our political arrangement. And what I do now is I'm negotiating I'm negotiating on with Aaron's boss on a little research project. It's fairly modest, but that I'll be doing for them, and then translating a book for the guy who started the Solidarity movement. I've been talking to a couple of the sort of English people who are a little bit more sort of the Mises Institute persuasion in South Africa, trying to organize things there. I've been working to try and put together a small publication so that I can draw writing from people who would be of a sort of dissident persuasion. And how should I put it? I don't want to put this too harshly, but anti-South African, in the sense that people who think that power should be divested from Pretoria into local provinces or regions, people who are talking about sort of independent policies and so on. So it'll be like it'll be sort of not much more than an online zine for a few months, I think. But I'm hoping to expand it to something serious in the long run, and then that's what I've got going really for myself in terms of South Africa and the movements there. I mean, the landscape for people who are trying to move away from the traditional bodies is very small. And the problem is that there's not a lot of intellectuals because everyone who goes to university is very, very left-wing. I mean, the University of Cape Town has for a long time been known as Little Moscow on the Hill because almost everywhere there is communist. I mean, I was a communist when I was there, and I joined the movement that kicked off the entire wave of iconoclasm that now plagues the English-speaking world, which is called Rhodes Must Fall. I was there from the beginning, occupying the admin buildings, and I didn't stay around for very long, and I made a lot of enemies out of it because I turned my back not only on the movement but everything they stood for. And what's left is there's this little vacuum where you've got what would traditionally be called the petty bourgeoisie, which is business owners and professionals and so on, who are trying to find a way of escaping, but they don't all have the means to frame what they're doing intellectually. And so we're just seeing the beginning of small business enterprises collectivizing in order to protect themselves from unions and government imposition. We're just, that kind of stuff is only slowly materializing now at this late stage in the game. And you've got a few indigenous movements in the Cape from among what is called the colored population. So you've got the Khoi and San groups and so on, and they reach out to very, very different groups of people to try and get a scrap of local power for themselves. And they try really weird, creative things like getting. They've managed to get intellectual property rights for a herb. So like rooibos tea, the red bush tea that you'd find in the supermarket and so on. So a portion of that actually goes to a group over there, and I interviewed a lady that was actually part of the campaign to get that done. And they were these movements were also part of the movement to get to allow independent candidates to run, which the coming municipal elections, the local elections, will be the first time that independent candidates can run, as opposed to just political parties. And so there's a large movement who will be pushing for the political parties, who are largely controlled by either international forces or revolutionary forces. There'll be an opportunity for people outside that system to stand. So there's like a lot of these like little movements that are very, very weak at the moment, but are trying very hard to try and reach out and break through the deadlock. And then against that, you have Democratic Alliance, the Liberal Party that I mentioned. That they've got a weird thing that they're doing at the moment where they've reached out to the United States. So they've signed an exclusive regional trade deal with the United States. So Google is going to run a cable to Cape Town, so they're going to get nice high-speed internet. And Pepsi has bought our Pioneer Food, which was one of the biggest food manufacturing brands in South Africa. Used to be mostly government stuff. So you have the brand of bread that used to be called government bread. Asco is now by the Americans. But part of the signing, I imagine there's some behind the scenes stuff, because they came into Parliament recently, and they reprimand. That the sort of like way that they do this in the UK and the US, where they reprimand Facebook and they're not doing enough to stamp out disinformation. So they pulled one of those, basically inviting Silicon Valley to come and police the digital space in South Africa. They have a lot of progressives amongst their rank, despite their sort of lip service to non-racialism, which don't discriminate against us in the law, etc. So my hopes are very slim, because what a lot of people are angling for at the believe might happen now is that a moderate faction of the ANC will ally with the Democratic Alliance for a coalition government, backed by structural readjustment of the IMF, which would be pressing pause and allowing a lot of erosion to occur in the meantime while we wait for the inevitable. And of course, the Democratic Alliance has denied this. They say that they're not seeking this, but I mean, I don't know what I don't know what to believe. It's hard to say, but the difficulty with parallelism is you've got so many laws against you, and I think that the fellows in Orania have some of the most immense ambitions. I mean, we know that the final boss of this great fight is the financial sector, and they've gone as far as setting up their own banking system. So this kind of attitude, and it's not the first time that Afrikaners have done this. I think that the Afrikaans nation as a whole is defined by its constant decision to not go where they're told to go, and this is the third attempt to escape English globalism that they've had historically. And the first time they left by simply walking away.
Literally.
Then they were conquered. Yeah, so they just walked into the inside of Africa and said, "Oh, we're just going to go."
The reason why you have Star Trek. The name Star Trek comes from the Great Trek.
Yeah.
Of people it's called the Great Move. They just picked their shit
sodding
up.
Off into the great dark beyond.
Yeah. Yeah, so the English pretty much came and said, "Yeah, you guys are going to be anglicized," and then the Afrikaner said, "Okay, well then I'm going this way," and he points directly at the bush.
And they didn't allow that to hold. And they came in, what was it, the 1880s the first time, and tried to shut that down. And
unfortunately, as history is a cruel storyteller, those Afrikaners, in search of their freedom, then went into the interior, found gold, and then England had them in their sights yet again.
They just happened to struggle off into this, vast wasteland they thought nobody would be interested in. It happened to be just full of gold, right?
Yeah, full of gold and diamonds,
and uranium,
and then you're not going to be left alone. What Rob said there is very true.
And then Afrikaans nationalism was the second time around. I mean, you with Afrikaner nationalism from most of the middle of the 20th century, the Afrikaners attempted to take the sort of Westphalian route to independence, which is you build an independent nation with its own culture and so on. And they failed to make the requisite sacrifices in terms of land and so on in order to give the other people in South Africa viable places that they could live. And they failed to divest themselves from economic dependence on Black Africa. And so this mutually hurting stalemate just grew and grew and grew until Afrikaners couldn't take it anymore, and the international community offered them a handout, said, "No, don't worry, you'll be fine." And they arranged the talks between the two parties, and all of them were made honorary members of high-ranking organizations, and the rest is history. And so, and now we've got to try again to build something outside of, this abstracted version of the British Empire that persists.
Well, that's actually a good segue into the Orania thing, because the big philosophy of Orania is own labor. They don't use labor from anywhere else except from people that live in the town. So you're not going to be living in luxury, and that's why there's a two-pronged answer to your question, Oliver. The question of what solutions are being implemented. So the first path is the path that I directly work with, and that's the solidarity movement, which is a collection of organizations, AfriForum, Solidarity, Help and a Hand, and they all came from a single group. Solidarity was the old Afrikaner Miners Union. And so they started pretty much this cultural movement called the Solidariteit Beweging. And that is the movement that is building these state-proof solutions like crowdfunding universities, building infrastructure, fixing roads, fixing their own communities, doing everything themselves. AfriForum being the civil rights organization wing of that movement, fighting in the courts, making sure the cultural rights and minority rights are protected. Then you have, and for example, with the farm murders as well, keeping up to date with statistics, compiling getting all the statistics in one place, doing neighborhood watches, doing farm patrols, helping training farmers to be able to defend themselves, and doing international campaigns to bring awareness. But the Orania story is actually the one I want to focus on, because I think it will demonstrate the point quite beautifully. So someone in the chat asked, "Is Orania still going?" Well, it's still going strong. It's growing every year. They don't have enough room for all the people that want to come live there, so they can only allow a small trickle at a time. They can't just let everyone come live there. They don't have enough space yet. So it's not that they don't have enough interest.
But that actually seems to me as though it fits very well. When you want a nightclub to fill up and with an exclusive clientele, you close the little ropes at the entrance and make sure a nice long line forms out front. So
I think the big point that Orania proves, and this is the hard point that a lot of your listeners, or the hard lesson that a lot of your listeners still need to learn. And that is the fact that it's not about what you want, it's about what you are willing to give up. So the Orania philosophy is not, I want this province or this piece of land, and I want my country here, and I want the country to be named this, I want my ethno-state. They pretty much said, I just want this little piece of desert, this little abandoned town, and I'm willing to give up the city life, I'm willing to give up my suburban house, I'm willing to give up my home, I'm willing to give up my job, I'm willing to give up my doctor, I'm willing to give up all these nice services and malls and all these conveniences of urban life, and I want to go live in this objectively, mathematically provable, shitty piece of the country in regards to the location, the soil, the weather. It's not there's nothing. As a South African, you can appreciate the beauty of the location of Orania, but for any person on the outside looking in, it's a very ugly location. There's no mountains, there's no sprawling hills. It's just a flat piece of desert. And it was a ghost town, basically. But the Orania philosophy proves something very important. And that is the question of what are you willing to give up? They were willing to give up everything except their freedom. And therefore, they have their freedom. They were willing to make a statement in regards to that's all I want, is I want my freedom. And they were willing to get it. But it's not the more individualistic, rugged individual freedom that the United States champions. It's a cultural community freedom, where you do your own work and you're busy from the morning till night, and you work very hard and you do your part in the community. You can't just be sitting on your hands doing nothing. You are constantly working your fingers to the bone, but you are able to live freely and to live very happily in a community that's safe, a community where your culture is preserved, a community where you have that almost romanticized experience of that a lot of trad cons want to go back to, that community experience. I mean, I've visited the town quite a few times. And the first time I was there, we were driving back at night, I think about like 8 in the evening. and it was already pitch black outside, and we just saw these two girls walking next to the road. They couldn't have been older than 8. And we asked them, "Are you okay? Where are you going?" They said, "No, we just went to the shops to go buy something. We're going back home, but thank you for offering assistance." And they were walking back in the pitch black of night, and they were safe there. The first time we visited there as well, my dad told me he'll give me $100 if I can show him a house with burglar bars. Now, if you're a South African, you know how bizarre that sounds. Every house has burglar bars. You can't not have burglar bars on your windows. I couldn't find a house with any burglar bars on it. But what people need to understand is it's not because it's a white community. It's because of the philosophy of the community. It's about the culture of the community. If you just take a random 1,000 white South Africans and you plop them in the middle of somewhere, it's not going to have the success of Orania. Orania's success lies in its philosophy, in its culture. That's why it is so important that the town preserves its culture, because it's that energy that makes it possible. That's why, for example, to get back to the solidarity movement, so when Saltec was built, the technical college, a lot of political analysts in South Africa said, well, this is nice that they have an Afrikaans university, but we need a Saltec and an AfriForum and a solidarity movement for all South Africans, seeing as this movement is an Afrikaans movement, which is a language. But the central problem there, as Dirk Herman, the head of the solidarity movement, said on my channel when I talked to him there, is that if you just have this movement for all South Africans, you lose that cultural energy. It was the cultural energy in the first place that made it possible what we were able to achieve. It's not because we are whites. It's not because we are South Africans. It's not because we are whatever. It's because of the culture behind it. It's because of the cultural energy behind it that's made it possible. And that's what a lot of people on the left and the right aren't able to grasp, it seems, for different reasons.
I think that's true. I think one of the things that you forget is that if you have a common culture, you actually have sort of a natural understanding of the direction that you're going to be going in when you're building new institutions. You have a natural understanding of the way of doing things, a protocol for doing businesses and so on. If you're dealing with people who are very heterogeneous in their cultural disposition, then there's a problem building trust for a start, and there's a trouble coordinating big things because there isn't a common understanding. And the thing is, it's starting to affect everyone in South Africa to some degree because the urban life has transformed completely the nature of South African people. If you go into the deep countryside in the sort of the old tribal areas, people are they're extremely gentle, soft-spoken, polite people, and they have their etiquette is extremely refined. They stick to traditional mores for the greater most part. And you go into the city and people are debauched and deracinated to a level that you cannot possibly conceive of. In South Africa, 60% of women in urban areas have engaged in prostitution at least once. So the level of destruction that has occurred for ordinary African people in South Africa as well it's really immense. I don't think people can quite comprehend how, and it kind of started before the end of apartheid as things began unraveling back then as well, because you had massive influx of black people into what was called white South Africa for decades before apartheid fell. And so the sort of what they called a petty apartheid, that sort of harsh segregating laws that everyone remembers it for the most part, they really, really had to become harsher and harsher and harsher to deal with the influx. And then eventually it just sort of popped because they couldn't control people. But that urbanization process.
I'm sorry, you raise an interesting point about it affecting the blacks as well. And I remember in what I had heard from the Don the Plebe interview regarding Orania. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the gentleman. Ernst, can you remind us?
Strijdom.
Right. He had mentioned that there was a black community nearby that they worked things out. They very explicitly said, look, we're not going to do it for you, but we will allow you to come and we will share our insights and give you whatever kind of assistance we can, so long as we're not reducing our own position. I wonder, are there Black communities attempting to do these same sorts of things?
Maybe just before you answer there, Rob, I think, what's very important here is exactly that point. Orania works with a lot of other cultural communities as well, whether they be Black or white or colored, that want to learn how to do exactly what they're doing. And I think that's the important point. I know many of your viewers might not like the answer. I know a lot of people already in the chat don't seem to agree, but it's the cultural question, man. It's not. If you think about it in terms of it's just because it's a bunch of white people. If you take 10,000 Capetonians, white Capetonians from the southern suburbs, and you put them in the middle of the desert, they're going to die.
Yeah.
But if you take 10,000 Afrikaners and you put them there, they're going to find a solution. So,
these are just people who are entirely unrealistic, who are waiting for.
That's the thing. Is if you look at South Africa, just one more thought, Rob.
You'd actually find. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
Look who are creating the solutions in South Africa, for example. It's not the race nationalists, it's the cultural thinkers. It's the cultural orientated people that are creating the solutions. Orania is a cultural town. It's not a racial town. You can, I know US Strydom, who was on Don de Pleb's channel, is the head of the Orania movement very well. And he will tell you very directly, the town does not have a racial criteria. It has a cultural criteria. You need to be able to speak Afrikaans, and you need to be a Christian, and you need to be an Afrikaner. You need to be fit into an Afrikaner town. I mean, there are Germans living in Orania. They're not technically Afrikaners, but those Germans learned Afrikaans within a year, and that's why they can live there. It's the town does not anywhere in its not constitution, but in its regulations have any racial criteria, and you have to ask yourself why. And the same goes for Solidarity and AfriForum. Solidarity and AfriForum, the Solidarity movement, the movement behind all these state-proof solutions, the movement that's building universities and colleges, is not a white nationalist movement. It's not a race-based movement. Anyone can be a supporter of Solidarity or AfriForum. AfriForum assists many other communities as well. A lot when we talk about minority rights, it's not just white minority rights, it's minority rights, period. We assist a lot of people in South Africa of all races, and that's where I'm going to finish this point. Then you have to ask yourself the question, why are the race nationalists not really building anything, and why are the culturally orientated people building stuff and really impressing people around them with their progress and what they're doing? And then you have to start asking the question, is it really a racial thing and not a cultural thing? It's that cultural energy that makes Orania possible, Solidarity possible, AfriForum possible. That's where all the energy is coming from. That's where the people are building. And I think the results speak for themselves.
I think this is very true. I think the thing is that when we look at something as sort of long and abstract as the racial groups that have come out of the sort of 19th century imagination, we end up with groups that really don't have a great deal in common. And looking at what sort of resulted in South Africa now, ignoring history for a minute, if I sort of stand in the middle of South Africa, there are a lot of people who are not white who I can get along with and trust a lot better than I can trust white people mainly from sort of liberal or left-wing backgrounds. And I mean, I've lived and worked. I lived and worked as a manual laborer on a farm for a year before I came to university, and the stark contrast really between the kinds of people you get out in the countryside and in the city are not. It's not like where you've got people who are a bit different, like in the West. It's like the difference that they're so alien to one another. It's almost incomprehensible, and so and I think one of the other things that we've got to realize is that the future of the West is, and this is kind of bringing it full circle to the way we opened this up, is we're saying that the future of the West is very similar. We're already seeing, and these forces are quite beyond most people's control. If you look at what was his name? The Belgian fellow with the big teeth. What's his name? The sort of EU imperialist who's a big shitty man in Brussels. Guy Verhofstadt. That's the man. Guy Verhofstadt. And Guy Verhofstadt was talking for a while about he wants to build Eurafrica. And so there's a large portion of people in the European Union who want to actually, just as Africa is now becoming this borderless entity, they want to now open the border with Europe. And so they want to really create a global South Africa. And it's very peculiar because in 1989, I'm sure some people will have heard of Nick Land in this part of the internet. So Nick Land wrote an essay in 1989 about Immanuel Kant and a whole bunch of other things. But he said he made a comparison, and at this time there was nobody who knew that there were even negotiations going on behind closed doors in South Africa. Everyone thought apartheid was going to stay in an infinite deadlock until it degenerated into civil war and violence. And he wrote about South Africa as being a representation of the world in miniature. And he said that the relation of the white metropolis to the black hinterlands is exactly the same as the white first world to the brown first world at a global level. Sort of center, periphery, that usual old-fashioned stuff. And funnily enough, at exactly the same time, the global elites were thinking precisely the same thing. And the dispensation that was organized in South Africa, where those boundaries were broken down, was the precise same dispensation that was organized for you. All of the international barriers came down and mass immigration began in earnest. And so now what we're witnessing is a concerted effort to build a global South Africa. And the aspirations of Joe Biden and his cabinet are transparent. They openly mention the comparisons that they wish to make between the governing and political model and theory in South Africa and the one that they want to put into place in America. They talk about a Truth and Reconciliation Council. They bring in the 1619 project to permanently inculcate the systems of guilt that we lived with.
Yes, with a chronologically prior claim designed for that reason to supplant what they positioned thereby as the later claim. 1776, who gives a damn? 1619 is earlier, and look, the stain, the original sin, is yet earlier. I think it's a very important point, and I'm not going to cut you off. I'm in fact going to invite you to expand further upon it, but I do want to mark that we're now about 12 minutes out, and I also want to give you guys the last few moments to again plug your own sites and the rest. And I thank you very much, but you have brought us very neatly around, Rob, to this sense of South Africa being the canary in the coal mine in some respects, or being ahead of the curve, and the rest of these kinds of things. So, you had just begun to go off in the direction of pointing out the ways in which these parallels occur. One of them that was mentioned earlier, I'll say it very quickly, was the business of how these different groups were all sort of united together early in South Africa to come in under an ANC umbrella, and the different groups were positioned in such a fashion that they would work together. It seems very much to me like the same sort of approach that you see with what gets glossed as intersectionalism. You pointed out the business of statues coming down. We see so many of these parallels. So I'd like to give you guys, you can fight over the remaining time, although I do have a hard cut at 2 hours, and we're about 11 and a half minutes out, because I want this to be able to go to other platforms, and they won't pick it up if it isn't 2 hours. But maybe tell us as your closing remarks what we need to know if you are in fact a little bit up beyond the horizon, in terms of seeing what's coming before we do. In addition to the many points you've already raised, what are the really key things that you want the people watching to take away from this discussion? Sort of like being rapped on the head with a hammer gently to bring them around to reality and what's coming.
If
I
it's
think
not
I'll
too much
be.
to ask, I think I can take this one because
Yeah, sure, go for it.
because one of the things that I've noticed, and I pay attention to the dissident rights sections of of the West, because they're the only ones who've been thinking interesting ideas for the past few years, except maybe for the Deleuzians, but the big problem is you're still thinking like a state. You're thinking like people who are used to thinking in a political system, but you're not anymore. It's been taken from you. You don't have it. Sure, there's nothing wrong with participating in voting, and I think it's still a good idea. But you should see the state as merely part of the environment, as one tree in the forest. Because if you don't learn to work with the instruments that are in front of you in your community and to build new instruments with people you can trust, your culture will die and your people will die and everything will turn to shit. And much of it will turn to shit because there's a lot of things out of your control, like the Reserve Bank that is printing like bejesus. I mean, I like to facetiously remark, first a global South Africa, then a global Zimbabwe. But you have, but you really are headed for serious decline, and the exit doesn't lie through the state, and you're not going to be able to control it. I don't think even the state is really in control anymore. They're desperately trying to patch the patronage networks that run at that level of society. I mean, why do you think the wealthy
just
are
maybe
trying to
a
build
very
turmoil?
quick thought there. Don't romanticize the exit. The exit is a very tough road, and no matter how much mental gymnastics you're doing currently, it's not nice. It's not an easy road.
And a lot of us. Yeah, and you will be persecuted. I mean, look, the state of affairs in South Africa as the security systems break down is that you have, if you and I, Ernest, both know people who have had their lives, their personal lives and their family members targeted because they're getting involved in the media. And it's something that happens all the time in the media, and even mainstream journalists just don't talk about it because they're so used to it. But it happens all the time. If you're involved in politics in any visible way, you are targeted, you are followed all the time. That's normal. And people in the West who are saying, oh, well, cancel culture. No, wait until these people are stalking you 24/7 with guns. Because, that's what happens. So all of this kind of thing is sort of like an imagined future that you kind of have to slowly be preparing for, at least mentally. And you have to be. I think there's a quote from. I don't know if everyone's seen The Wire. I still think The Wire is quite fantastic, even if it is from a bit of a liberal perspective. It really does portray a lot of reality, and there's a fellow called the Deacon in there who says that the policeman says doesn't this seem futile trying to fix junkies all the time? He says no. Look, at the best of times, doing good is like sweeping leaves on a windy day. That got to me because it's true. If you're trying to do anything decent in a world that's full of shit, it is an uphill battle, and a lot of your gains will be taken from you.
Yeah, I see. We have 8 minutes left, so I'll also keep it very brief. Yeah, I think as I said there during Rob's answer, the way out is not easy. The way out is very hard, and unfortunately, a lot of people on the right fall into the same type of logic as our progressive opponents, just with a different dressing to it. A lot of the conspiracy theories on the right mirror the conspiracies of the left actually quite eerily. And a lot of the solution or the logic of the right also currently, especially more on the dissident right, actually also mirrors a lot of the leftist logic just from a different angle. So my advice there would be, and you can take it or leave it, but as someone in a third world country that's currently fighting for the survival of his cultures, a super minority, if you will, like I said, take it or leave it. My advice is learn from South Africa, but learn the hard lessons, not just the easy lessons that you want to see. A lot of people look at South Africa and they learn the lessons that they wanted to learn, but it's not really the lessons that they needed to learn. In South Africa,
I had a funny conversation. I had a conversation that I had here in this town in the Netherlands that I think illustrates very clearly your point that you learn the lessons that you don't want to learn. So I met a very friendly older Dutchman who was talking to me about various things, and he mentions immigration and how many Turks and Moroccans there are in the town, and how dominant they're becoming in the high street. And he says to me, very soon, our young men will have to pick up firearms, and there will be a war. And sort of, I was thinking to him, well, that's very exciting and everything, but if you if you start down that road, you have to realize that in reality you're probably going to have to cut coalition deals with these people and live with them, and so hating them is absolutely pointless. And it'll be a long time before the Netherlands falls. I think that they're going to manage much better than much of the West in managing ethnic pluralism, which is the future of the West. And America will be much worse. America will be experiencing much of what South Africa is, in my opinion. But again, these are your neighbors. Turning them into enemies is foolish. You're going to be sharing a space with them. You have to learn that even though when things turn to chaos, people what's it? Birds of a feather flock together. You are going to have to make friends with everybody because they're human beings. You're human beings. You have the same common goal, which is survive, and that has to be number one.
Yeah, and one of my last remarks there will be one of the hard lessons that you're going to have to learn from South Africa is that an alliance based on culture is much more rugged and robust than an alliance just based on race. That's the reality, man. That's where you're going to have to learn the hard way.
Just look at who your biggest enemies. It's the white leftists, not anyone else.
Don't just outsource the existential dread by thinking there's like some other puppet master trying to destroy you. Your biggest enemies are within your own camp. Your biggest enemies are right next door. And if the sooner you learn that, the much sooner you can start thinking of real solutions. The longer you think that your true enemy is just some disembodied enemy out there that doesn't look like you and doesn't have anything to do with you, the longer you're going to be chasing shadows. Your biggest enemy is that guy that looks exactly like you, that's within your camp, that speaks your language, and that pretty much is part of your quote-unquote tribe. So the quicker you can learn that lesson, the quicker you can pretty much get yourself out of the shit that you are currently in. So I think that will be my concluding remark. To just repeat myself, you're going to have to learn some lessons that you don't want to learn.
And I would add to that, in any case, no matter how anybody who's viewing it may think about this, the reality is that all the oldest stories about a people's identity and their struggles over time, like I studied a number of them from Central Asia, they called them dastans, right? And in addition to a war cry, which is also a password and battle cry, they've got a clan sign, and then they have a destan. They're stories that are orally remembered, and all those stories, even indeed to all the historical ones in Europe, if you look back far enough, they feature the story of the betrayer, which is always this sort of central figure that most calls into question the future existence of the people as a whole. And so that really does underscore your point, that look within for where some of the problems are. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't enemies without as well. It'd be stupid to say so, but certainly the ones who are inside your citadel with you, who in colorful ways are able to open up the gates to admit anyone. They're in a unique position to be able to do so. That is the biggest problem.
The poem Raka, there you go.
Well, now the issue is that we're just like a minute or so out, so I want to give the very quickly, gentlemen, because I want to cut this under 2. Go ahead and tell people where they can find more of you. I effusively thank you very, very much for your time. It's been a great discussion, but take the remaining time, each of you, to plug your own channels, drive some traffic over there, get some support for your own projects and efforts.
Yeah, well, mine's very quick. You can just check out the link in the description to my YouTube channel. I have conversations with many South Africans and people abroad about matters concerning South Africa and some big ideas and some lessons that might be difficult to learn. So you can go check that out. You can follow me on Twitter as well, at CARACAL or Conscious CARACAL.
Well, you can. My name's Robert Duigan. Actually, that's Duigan. And I have a Twitter account that you can follow. And when my little sort of Cape nationalist paper is up and running, I'll let everyone know. In the meantime, I have a blog that you can read where I've written stuff about South African history, about philosophy, about all kinds of funny things. Some of them obnoxiously long, like 9,000 words or what have you, but most of them fairly reasonable. And then I've got a channel under my
10 seconds.
former video channel as well. So go to my Twitter. The links are there.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen.